morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be interviewing Brenton Saunders, who is a super expert in healthcare. And hopefully he's going to answer some of the questions that we all have with regards to a new era in healthcare based on everything that's happening in our world in the last couple of years. I think, Brent, the first question that most of us would want to ask you is about the race to the vaccine. We see a lot in the news about vaccines. We see some countries launching some. We see different kinds of vaccines. There's a lot of questions whether or not this will sort of resolve the pandemic. What's your view? Where do we stand in the race to the vaccine?
So first, Frank, thanks for having me, and thanks to the International Economic Forum and the World Strategic Forum for having this session. So look, I think that's a long answer. I'm optimistic. I'll start by saying I'm optimistic about where we stand on the race for a vaccine. Just this morning, we saw a few companies announce that they're moving into final stage testing of their vaccine. That puts several vaccines in the final stages of testing. There are hundreds, over 100 in development behind those. They're using a variety of different technologies. So shots on goal, we have several. And, from a scientific perspective, this isn't a difficult vaccine to create. This isn't like HIV or some of the more difficult viruses that hide in the body. This virus is easily identifiable. It hasn't mutated in any dramatic way, and so vaccinating against it is pretty straightforward. That being said, it normally takes 7-10 years to create a vaccine, to do all the testing and safety testing and analysis on a vaccine, and we're moving as an industry at warp speed to bring this vaccine to around the world. And, I couldn't be prouder of the biopharmaceutical industry with this particular initiative. They've jumped in with both feet. My guess is economically this won't be a huge return on capital for that industry, but they're doing it to solve a real time world health problem. And I think we'll start to see, finalists get to the finish line in the next few months.
That's amazing, considering how long it normally takes. What do you see in terms of actually being able to distribute a vaccine? Because it's one thing to be able to have one that works, is another one to get it out to potentially billions of people.
Yeah, and therein lies a challenge. I was actually speaking with a very large real estate developer here in South Florida a couple weeks ago, and he said to me, well, I don't get it. Why can't we just have a vaccine? And I said to him, I don't get it. Why can't we just have a 70-foot skyscraper on a block next door? We know how to build buildings. We built lots of buildings. Why can't we just have one? And he said, well, we have to do surveys. We have to create architectural plans. We need inspections. We have to pour concrete. We got to do piping. I said, well, that's how you make a vaccine. You have to make it. That being said, what I think is amazing here is the leading pharmaceutical companies that are at the front of this race have been manufacturing the vaccine at risk. And that's no small task to do. So they've actually been planning for success in their testing. And upon approval, which could happen this calendar year, towards the end of this year, they could have hundreds of millions of doses available. I think the issue will be, how do you get to several billion for the entire world? And that's going to take some time. But I would think that in countries like the United States or Europe or others that have made significant investments behind supporting these vaccines, at least those people at risk should have access to a vaccine within months of the approval.
And what do you think of some of the treatments they've been discussing or fast tracking, like the plasma treatment? Will that have any major impact on the evolution of the pandemic, or are we really depending pretty much exclusively on a vaccine functioning?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is for a lot of lay people, they got frustrated, or the media, has played an interesting role in talking about the healthcare community's response to this vaccine, or to this pandemic, or this virus. What's interesting is when the virus first appeared and we saw, hotspots out west, or in New York City, and we saw higher mortality rates. We didn't know much about this. Remember, they called this a novel virus in that it was the first time it appeared in humans, and the first time we started to gather data of this virus in humans was in January, February. So, we have in record time learned a tremendous amount about this virus and how it works in the immune system and how it impacts the organs of the body. And what's amazing is over that very short period of time, in terms of science and healthcare, we got to get really smart on how to treat this. And so the protocols of how we treat this virus are dramatically different than how they were just a few months ago. And what we've seen is very few people on a relative basis dying or being severely ill from the virus, because we know so much more about how to treat it and what to do. And so treatments like the plasma treatments, they're good for those that are seriously ill, but ultimately we need immunity from this, and the best way to get there to return to the new normal would be a vaccine. But my hat's off. I think a lot of people got to see how sausage is made in terms of how science and medicine is done. It's a lot of trial and error, but an amazing amount of work by a large community in the healthcare and research and biopharmaceutical industries.
It's an interesting point you make about how the vaccine development is basically at risk and not a particularly lucrative product, if you will, for the pharmaceutical industry. So it's truly commendable, the amount of energy and effort that has been going into this from the private sector. And it sort of segues into the next question I was going to ask you, which is, how do you see the pandemic changing healthcare? Because when you talk about the new normal, I think it very much is going to be a new normal. How do you see it affecting the industry?
Yeah, look, I think if there's a silver lining, so to speak, with respect to the pandemic, it's I think the opportunity to improve and change how healthcare services are delivered. In large part, from when I was a kid and we used to go to the pediatrician and we'd sit in the waiting room and read old magazines and wait for the doctor, who was typically late, and you got your 10 minutes and moved on. Healthcare is pretty much delivered the same way. You still go to the same offices, read the same magazines. Maybe they're still there 40, 50 years later, but it hasn't changed all that much when you think about how the rest of the service industries have changed and how we live our lives so differently after the last 40, 50 years. So healthcare needed some kind of catalyst. I always say the worst enemy to healthcare is inertia. It's very hard to change something in healthcare. And so maybe the pandemic has changed the way we think about it. Maybe we go to more efficient delivery of healthcare using telemedicine and virtual visits, which I think are so much more efficient for the vast majority of healthcare. Hopefully people will realize that, staying home when you're sick is not just something you do because you need the rest, but it's doing it because you're helping all your colleagues stay healthy. There's a lot of expense and lost productivity from people spreading flu and common cold and other things in the workplace. And so I think people are more aware of these types of things. And then lastly, I'm hopeful that what we have seen in some of the data is that most people become seriously ill or die from COVID-19 are really those with comorbidities, obesity, diabetes, and the like. And so hopefully people will start taking more responsibility, more interest, and more accountability for their own healthcare, and recognizing that living as healthy as you can is important for all the reasons we saw with coronavirus, but also all the other things that come later in life, like heart disease and cancer.
So speaking to that, do you see any differences between the way different countries around the world are handling this? Do you see any sort of best practices coming out? that are innovative that other countries around the world are doing? What's your view in terms of how asymmetrical this is?
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't have to necessarily look at other countries. You could look at different states in the United States to see various approaches. And, there's the approach that's largely adopted by the states in the Northeast, which was really to lock down and clamp down on all social activities. And there are places like Florida that had more of a mixed approach to the virus. And, I think there are a lot of people who will say that various approaches are right or wrong. I think we really won't know till we have more data and more clean and comparable data. But ultimately, I think that the equation probably was calculated wrong in terms of how to approach the virus. And what I mean by that is a lot of what we have done as a country and a lot of countries around the world have followed suit, which was a very noble and appropriate goal of complete elimination of the transmission of the virus. The reality is, by doing that, there are huge public health consequences. And so what we'll see in a couple years from now is that there was a period of time where people didn't go for cancer screenings, mammograms or colonoscopies or other things like that, or skin cancer checks, because they were in lockdown mode, or their doctors weren't open, or they weren't even allowed to go to the doctor because they were considered elective visits. The reality is that there could be millions of people who are impacted in a negative way because of those types of policies, and so my sense is there's a balance to this. People should wear masks. People at risk should be super careful and stay home. But there's another side of this that we won't know from a public health perspective the impact of for years to come.
And how do you see, so you talked a little bit about the way healthcare is delivered, and I think we've seen that across many industries where technology is playing a key role in helping connect us when we're unable to connect directly in ways that we're accustomed to. Particularly in the business community, the impact has been the immediate adoption of some technologies that have been out there for some time but have not been sort of utilized to the degree where I think the new normal will use them. And one of those areas in healthcare is telemedicine. And I myself have availed myself of it recently. It's all been out in the market before, but wasn't really broadly adopted. How do you see that changing the model? How do you see that helping us sort of balance what you're talking about between the need to have basic healthcare maintenance, but at the same time, sometimes a fear of contagion?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of telemedicine. I think it helps make healthcare more accessible to all. I think it's more efficient, and it can drive better utilization and better preventive care. And so, think about hopefully the future of 2021. You could be at work and have a checkup appointment and do that hopefully from your office at your employment, or maybe a conference room or a quiet room, or even from your home if you're having to take care of children or an elderly parent or something. And so you don't have to get out and drive. You don't have to get out and sit in a waiting room for an hour. And so the increased efficiency is dramatic, which should help drive down the costs of preventative healthcare and routine healthcare. And so, I think even in the elderly that need someone to drive them to the doctor or get out, and if they're immobilized, special aides and others to get them to the doctor, this can help democratize the availability to preventive care and routine checkups. And so I think it's a phenomenal opportunity, and I hope it sticks. I hope that after this pandemic ends, the technologies continue to improve, the openness of the healthcare provider community continues to be there, and the rules and regulations around providing and billing for services provided over the web or internet continue to be improved. And I think if all those things happen, we have a recipe for a great step forward in the efficiency of the provision of healthcare.
So one of the things that's surprised me has been all the innovation I've been seeing in testing. And there have been a number of different approaches to this. Some of the most interesting involve spectrographic analysis of using cameras that have incredible ability to get into detail and can actually discern whether there are antibodies or remnants of virus in saliva, and these tests, these improvements in testing may also be useful in other types of viral illness as well. And so I was wondering what you think about the efficacy of testing, where you see that going, and if you see that as a sort of in the new normal, an innovation that can be really good for the portion of humanity that's suffering from chikungunya, dengue, Ebola, whatever, all of the other illnesses that we had before, COVID came along.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think another really important fact, you hit the nail on the head, Frank, is the diagnostic community. I mean, it has been in the developed world, diagnostics has been kind of a very exclusive club in that most diagnostic technologies and tests had to be performed in a CLIA lab, a certified lab, and we've never democratized diagnostic testing so that it's available for the masses in an affordable and accessible way. And so, the technologies exist and have existed for some time, but they've never been really applied in this kind of setting because of the way the rules, regulations, and reimbursement work for diagnostic testing. But I think we see a huge opening here where the governments around the world, the payers of healthcare services around the world have realized that there's a huge opportunity to improve care by having better diagnostics. And it's not just COVID, as you said. Think about if we could just diagnose the flu or the common cold. And, many antiviral treatments only work if you take them immediately upon the infection period, usually in the first 24, 48 hours. So if we can diagnose these things, and if we know you're contagious, you need to stay home from work or stay away from your keep your kids home from school or what have you, or you're safe to go back to work or back to school, think about the improvements in productivity and cost savings to the system if we could do that for the diagnostic community. And so there's so many technologies chasing the answer here for COVID, but you're right. Most of these technologies will work for a variety of different bacteria and viruses and infectious diseases, as well as potentially cancer screenings and other things that could really be, again, brought out to the masses, brought out in a more democratized way so that they're accessible to everybody and they're relatively inexpensive. And so if we had better diagnostics, we'd have a better healthcare system by a long shot. So another huge opportunity for healthcare to make a huge step forward here. So
let's broaden things out a bit and talk about the future of the economy in general. How do you see this sort of new normal affecting the economy? What's the future of our economy?
Yeah, I think right now, if we looked at the current state of the economy, I'm a little concerned about it. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think that the Fed in particular has done a really nice job trying to intervene and provide liquidity into the market and backstop the market, and that has worked for now. Stock market is at an all-time high, but the bifurcation of the success of the stock market versus the real economy is scary to me a little bit. I think that we need to get the economy open. We need to get people back to work. We need to really make sure that unemployment drops and people have the ability to work in an open environment, in a safe open environment, I should say. But there's a big disconnect right now, and hopefully over time these things start to converge, and we see a strong stock market that's that's being supported by a strong underlying economy, not a Federal Reserve or fiscal policy that's just providing immense liquidity into the system.
Yeah, I've heard some people referring to it as being drunk on liquidity from the government assistance that's coming out of the Fed, which very clearly has allowed the economy not to suffer, catastrophic declines. But I think you're absolutely right. The real concern is job creation. We lost somewhere around 40 million jobs. A lot of them came back. Looks like some of the ones that came back aren't staying. So I think really, one of the concerns that I have, or that I wanted to ask you about it as a businessman, not just in the healthcare industry, but in general, is that it looks like this disruption that will be caused by the pandemic sort of comes at a time when we were already going through other types of disruption in the world economy. And so where do you see some of the the fragile points? Where do you see some of the industries that will be truly distressed, and where do you see opportunities in others?
Yeah, so a great question, Frank. I think, well, my biggest concern over the macro environment is the bifurcation of the haves and those that are working class, and so as the stock market continues to power forward, clearly those invested in the market continue to do well, but most of the population in the United States is not invested in the stock market, and so they get left behind. And so, we need to make sure that we have more equity and fairness in the system, and that everybody gets brought along, not just those that are invested in the stock market. I think the second thing is a lot of the service industries have been profoundly impacted, in particular, restaurants. And I look at what's happening in New York City. I recently moved from New York to Miami last year. And, it's just so sad to see all these restaurants closing and all the people who work in those restaurants displaced and looking for work. And I don't understand Mayor de Blasio in New York's point of view on this, but, I saw recently where he said that restaurants were for the wealthy, but I know a lot of people who work in restaurants and they're not wealthy and they need the jobs. They need the pizzerias opened again. They need to be able to access the service industry in cities like New York, because that's one of the most vibrant parts of that city. And we're seeing that in other places like San Francisco. We're seeing that even here in Miami. We just opened indoor dining, I guess, yesterday. But, the restaurant community, which is, the bedrock of a tourist city like Miami, or the cruise industry, or the travel industry, or the tourism industry needs to come back in these cities. And we need to do it in a safe way.
Yeah, well, clearly tourism is one of the most devastated industries from this pandemic. And I was curious, I've seen a lot of different plans and ideas in terms of how to get that back on track even before, say, we have a vaccine or some degree of herd immunity. And there's been a lot of talk about how the healthcare industry can help with that, both in terms of rapid testing in situ, possibly, in addition to better contact tracing and other sorts of initiatives. How do you see that sort of marriage between healthcare and tourism helping get this industry back on track?
Yes, I think that's right. Look, I think we could wait a long time for all those things to come together to get these things back on track, but we know a lot already on how to open up in a safe way the economy, and that is to mandate mask wearing, to have lots of hand sanitizers, continue to promote and train people on washing their hands and taking appropriate measures to protect everybody. I think, reasonable social distancing, 50, 75% capacity inside restaurants, 6 feet spreading. If you're sick, stay home. If you're vulnerable or you're elderly or you have a big comorbidity, stay home. But for 85, 90% of the people following these very basic rules, we can get a lot of things open, a lot of opportunity to move forward. We just need everyone to do their part and take responsibility for it and go on. I go out regularly, but I always wear a mask. If you're wearing the appropriate mask and you're wearing it the right way, and there's a lot of craziness in the mask world too, but if you wear the appropriate mask and you wear it appropriately and you know how to wear a mask, it's not that difficult. You put it over your nose and your mouth. You don't wear it, under your and expose your nose. You can go out and do almost anything.
So a little bit along those lines, as a businessman who also has to interact with a significant amount of government regulation in a highly regulated industry, what kind of report card would you give the government in terms of how they've dealt with the pandemic? And how do you feel about the fact that, at least in the United States, the decentralized nature of the way healthcare is managed and regulated, has that been a detriment to dealing with the pandemic? Has it been more helpful? What is your view on the government side of this from the private sector?
Yeah, look, I think the government in large part has not done well. And that's just not the federal government, that's state and local governments as well. There's certainly exceptions to that. But let's take the federal government. I would be very supportive of a national mask mandate. I don't know under what authority they could do that, but they certainly could invest in promoting mask wearing. They could provide subsidies for masks. We could provide masks for free. We could mail out everybody $1,000 check. We could also provide masks to the United States population free. We could have centers that distribute masks, and that would have gone a long way. If you look at states, let's take New York State. I get that they had to lock down New York in February and March, but why'd they have to lock down the whole state? Upstate New York didn't have the same types of things. So this one approach to fit all doesn't make sense. Even here in Florida, last month, we were sitting outside eating dinner in 95-degree weather, sweating, and I had to go meet a business colleague for dinner up in Fort Lauderdale, and they were sitting inside with no masks. So why in Miami are we doing it one way, and an hour north or less than an hour north, we're doing it a different way? It makes no sense to me. And so, we could have had more uniformity, but we could have also had more common sense. And for whatever reason, on both sides of the aisle, the virus and the response to the virus was highly politicized. And I think there was just a huge misstep by the governments at the federal and local levels because of the politicization of the virus. That being said, there are some good things. I mean, I think Operation Warp Speed really is something that's very positive that the government has done to promote the vaccine development, and it's actually working. And we're going to have a vaccine. We're going to have multiple vaccines in record time with some amazing technologies.
So one last question for you before we end this very interesting interview, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and incisiveness. It seems to me that you're cautiously optimistic about the future economy, despite the disruption from the pandemic. What advice would you give to the other folks that are listening in on this from the business community in terms of how they prepare for the new normal?
Well, it really depends. I've always been an optimist. I think we live in the greatest country in the world. We certainly have our issues, and I'm glad that a lot of the issues have surfaced during this pandemic that we can start to work through and make our country a better place. But that being said, there's no greater country. I've traveled all over the world for the last 30 years, and every time I come back to the United States, I'm so happy that I was privileged enough to be born here and to be raised here and educated here. And so we should look forward to the future. But let's do it in a more constructive way. Let's all work to make this a better country, a more tolerant country, a more open country. But remember, there is still no better country than the United States. And so, let's go forward with an open mind, with a sense of optimism. And my guess is the next decade is going to be the greatest decade we've ever seen.
Thank you very much for your time, Brent, today. I appreciate it. And I'm sure so do all of those who are listening in.
Thank you, Frank.